I do this with a little bit of trepidation because I haven't done exactly this kind of thing before. And then also, it's the first time in my life I'm going to rely a little bit on PowerPoints. I hate that, but I've got a lot to say, and some of it's got a lot of pieces. And you kind of need to understand the way those pieces fit. So I'm going to do that. I'm sorry. I don't even know how to do it, but maybe you can help me. Here's the concern. I want to invite you into this conversation about where we are right now. Where we are with these ideas. What do they mean at this point? What could we imagine coming up next? What part do they play in cultural and intellectual history? And to do this in part because intellectual fashions come and go. Practical fashions come and go. All the great ideas about how organizations should function of even 20 years ago, you almost don't hear about them today. Most intellectual theories are dead within 20, 30 years. Now, social construction, the sort of basic ideas, grew up and basically they're children of the 70s and 80s. And that's when the major ferment really took place. Well, in some sense, the focus on those ideas in themselves, you can begin to see waning as an intellectual challenge. So then what happens? Where are we at that point? I don't think the ideas themselves are dead, and certainly in some sense I don't think they will die that easily. Indeed, I was really happy. Just before I came, the third edition of Invitation to Social Construction just came out with Sage in London, so it was really nice. And it's a third edition, and they're very up for that. Let's begin back with what we'll call cultural and intellectual modernism, going back several hundred years here. To describe it, you'll talk about individual persons, the chair, the video, the microphone, the tables, and so on. Almost an inventory, but that's an inventory in terms of atoms, that is, individual, isolated things. You start there. It's a world of things. And those things have some stability. That is, to be a thing is almost at the same time to say there was stability, because if it weren't stable, it would be difficult to say thingness. It would just be moving. You couldn't grasp it. So to be an atomistic world is also to be a world of some stability. And that more or less this is going to be pretty stable for most of our lifetime. And we even have this conception that each other is stable with a basic personality, for example, which is just there, or genetic makeup, which is simply there for a lifetime. So some stability. Now, when you add in a kind of Cartesian notion that the world is also rational, and that there should be a rationality that's not just accidental, that all these things are here, and we can predict them. And that we can also begin to say, then, why does that happen? Well, here we have predictability among the atoms. We need a theory, that is, a rational framework in which to place those observations. So we begin to speculate and to test those theories, and pretty soon, as we talk about it, we've got knowledge of those relations among the atoms as a map of the world, a predictive, useful map of reality. So go to the first slide. Okay, so I'm going to call this complex here. Let's use the metaphor as often done of a machine. Just because that's what ties them together and sort of visually is a machine. Machine made up of parts. The parts are causally related. The machine works over time. You could predict the relation among the parts. You have a theory of the mechanics. And you could have a map which will allow other people to make that machine in the same way. Oh, mechanistic metaphor. Now in some sense, all of this just disappears into the background. Of course, there are individual units and causal relationships. I mean, what else would there be? And science has tried to give us a map, and it's a useful map. But now all that becomes part of a way of life. Let's go to the second slide. It's sort of built into the assumptions then, wrapped into the assumptions are forms of life with which we're all pretty familiar with. You flip on. Okay, scientific truth, okay? We want to test those theories to end up with truth. And this, the whole science movement, sort of, if you look at modernism as being several hundred years old, science becomes the apex of that movement in the 20th century, kind of the sun, where a scientific way of looking at things becomes the dominant way, where the universities are primarily because they don't predict anything. They're not particularly useful. So we do objective research, and the notion here is we're going to come back to this infinite progress. Because if we keep testing the theories against the facts, the maps get better and better, and we can indeed predict virtually everything. As in psychology, the hope was that if we can study and know what the individual mind is like, we can contribute to infinite well-being. Everyone will be happy, prosperous, growthful. The organization is a rational system. We can study that system. Management science becomes the creation or the attempt to document what that system would be like, and indeed how you could manage it as a machine. Mental health. Something goes wrong with a person, let's diagnose, find the problem with the machine, what's wrong with the machine, and fix it, i.e. cure it. Education, well, what is education but taking all that good knowledge about the real world, things that we really know about, and giving it to students, because you must know this. You must know this. Governing as a system. Well, in the same way, society is chaotic. It's essential that you govern it in some way, that you have government to make sure it all goes well, that the road systems go well, the airlines go well, the tax system functions, and so on. Education systems function, and albeit it's a democracy, at least for a lot of us, it's simply giving permission for those people to govern. And your voice after that may go unheard. Measurement, assessment, I mean, this is all about predicting and controlling to make a better and better future, better and better life. So assessment of, are we doing it? Is this working? Becomes essential. Whether it be assessment in education to make sure that every student is getting it, the knowledge that the system of education is functioning, right? Really essential that you know these things, that teachers are functioning, and therefore we need mass attempts to measure and make sure the whole system is functioning. Feedback, change the system if it's not functioning. Same with any kind of initiative to change policies in society. Is it functioning? How is it functioning? Let's assess it. Same with the therapy. Can you document that the therapy is actually having an effect? I mean, it's just, of course we want to measure these things. Of course we want to have feedback on, is it working? I mean, it's just common sense, isn't it? And this is all gets tied up with economic rationality, and I don't simply mean economics in the broad sense of money, I mean in terms of everyday life. Leading a life in which you ask yourself every day, what am I doing? Is it having any kind of effect? Am I gaining from it? Is anybody gaining from it? How good is my teaching? How good is my consulting? How good is my therapy? It's like asking, even in your spare time, what am I getting from this? I mean, you don't go running just because it's fun. Usually you go running because it's healthy. You start eating because it's healthy, not because you enjoy it, because it's healthy. You want a payoff from it, a product from it, an outcome from it, and conceivably you could measure it, getting on the scales every morning, looking at your cholesterol count. So that life becomes a matter of, well, this produces that, and it's that which I'm producing which is the important thing, and it can be measured. And our life is just tied up with this. How can we measure what it is we're doing, and is it making us, is there an outcome from it? And God forbid I should just fly around and do nothing. I mean, it's almost the worst sin of modernism, is just do nothing. And I don't know about you, but I mean, I'm caught up in this as well. It's hard for me. Going to the beach is my idea of hell. I mean, just lying there, there's nothing to do. So you go walking, because at least that's healthy. We bought a hammock once. It's never been used. We put it up, 4 summers running, and it just started rotting. But nobody lay in a hammock. Because it's just not our life. You're not producing day and night. It's like, what else is there to do? And I look at that all, so I mean, we're part of it. We're caught up in it. Okay. Now we're also so aware that so much of this is a problem for us, that we're caught up in organizations which do not, from our sort of welfare point of view, function very well. They're oppressive, difficult. The measurements, oppressive, difficult. The grand plans never quite work out. Things don't go well. You have to have more police. You have to have more ways of making sure everybody is doing the right thing, and so on. It's like we kind of, in some ways, got up here with modernism in terms of living our lives. Now, it's at this point that you get what this is sort of the second chapter, this kind of postmodern move in the latter half of the 20th century. Let's go back to the first slide. Where social construction picks up is in a set of dialogues that were largely, as I say, 70, 80, 90s dialogues, which were largely intellectual, but you could find basis within the culture. Nothing that happens in intellectual life is cut away from the culture. All that attack, however, that critique, was really knowledge's map. That was where the problem was for the intellectuals. Because that was supposed to be a neutral, value-free map of the world the way it is, which everybody could agree to, everybody should agree to, because that's knowledge everybody should be educated into. And the critiques were, large, this is in so many books, just that knowledge is not value-free. This is a critical movement from Marx to feminism and so on. It's value-saturated. Every statement out of our mouth about the nature of the world comes with ideology somewhere implicit in it, with an underlying sense of what ought to be, not what is the case, but what ought to be. Now science becomes part of ideology. Secondly, that whatever we say in science is, we cannot escape our languages. That the languages become that which we must use regardless of the way the world is. So that we have a language with nouns, that is naming things, or pronouns, persons. And if you describe the room, you would use those nouns, because that's all you've got. because it is the way the world is, but because that's the language and it will strangulate you and control you. That's the whole linguistic literary critique. And the third one came out of philosophy of history of science, sociology of knowledge, social studies of science, which has been a main argument for social constructionists, and that is that whatever we take to be true, whatever we take to be knowledge and reason, comes out of groups who are collaborating together to make it so. That is, these are communities. Scientific departments of knowledge are like communities, each with their own language that they speak, each of the things they try to do with that language. Not because the languages are true, but because that's the languages they share, and that's what they do with it. And there are values attached to that. Every one of those languages is something they're trying to do because to them it's valuable. But now, if you crawl into that space of knowledge is not a map, then the rest of this begins to kind of crumble. And because you say if knowledge is not a map, if we're constructing that in small groups of people, then the universe is not necessarily atomistic. It's not necessarily made up of things. That's debatable. Whatever we call the thing, we could call it something else. And we could not even look at it as a thing. So everything, the whole atomistic worldview then becomes subject to, I'm not so sure about that. We might be able to reconstruct that. If that's the case, then causality becomes a problem. Causality is not a necessary way that things are. Causality is a construction. Take it or leave it. It's optional. We don't want to look at our relations as causal. I cause you through my language to do what you're doing. What kind of conception is that? That we hit each other like billiard balls, where there are the powerful and the weak, and the powerful just hit each other, and then you move as a cause-effect relationship. Why do we adopt that? Why predictability? Why is that the central aim of what we're doing? Why is my knowledge of you knowledge when I can predict who you are and what you're going to do? Who are these people as social scientists looking down on the rest of us and saying, aha, I can watch you through one-way mirrors, I can measure you, I can predict you. People down there, what kind of relationship is that of the social sciences to the world? It's hierarchical, in which we have the knowledge, and the people we study, the objects. Now we can give the knowledge to those who govern and have better governance, as in mental health. We govern the system of those who are wretched, and we put them in categories, and we then cure them. Why do we do all that? Who said that was true? Can we reconstruct it? I mean, all this sort of, you're familiar with this, you kind of live in this world, right? I'm just trying to point out that once you question knowledge as map, the whole rest of the modernist set of assumptions begins to crumble. And you begin to ask, well, what about explanations? I didn't, I'm sorry, I didn't, yeah, I did, I said, what about explanations? Well, okay, we understand each other largely psychologically, because the explanation of how we work or function has been traditionally something lies behind the eyeballs, namely mental process. Why should we presume that? Why do we have to explain each other with mental process? Let me give you a footnote here. Once you assume that the world is atomistic, then everything that exists is composed of something smaller, or what's behind it. So if you take this bodily existence, it runs by something else which is smaller, which is made up of. So that you can find the mental behind the physical, you can find the neuro behind the mental, and eventually, as you move down the scale, you'll get to atoms and then subatomic particles in this continuous quest for the tiniest, tiniest, tiniest thing, which is infinite. But the invitation is always for an explanation, which is not the thing, which is something smaller or behind it, which makes it work. Well, what the question is, why do we have to have those kinds of explanations? Because the whole construction of the rest of it, I mean, all the rest of it is a construction. Why explain it? Why have a theory behind that which exists? Okay. Next chapter. Now, as I say, social constructionist theory largely came out of that whole postmodern movement. Where has that gone? Just some sense. Where has it gone intellectually? Well, in a lot of different directions. For some disciplines in the universities, constructionist ideas aren't talked about anymore because they're just part of the background. You don't have to fight through that. That's the beginning. A lot of cultural anthropology is like that. You just assume that whatever you write about another culture is from a Western perspective. Duh. And it's going to be carry Western values. Duh. I mean, it's like, yeah, okay, that's where we begin. It's just built in. There's another whole vast complex of people who talk very much like everybody in this room, who are called social constructivists. Now that, in some way, in many parts of the academic world, there isn't any difference between social construction and social constructivism. That's just a different way of talking about the same body of ideas. Where it gets to be a little bit different is that constructivists will buy into more of a psychological way of looking at construction. That is, there's a tendency within constructivists, social constructivists, to look at the site of the construction in the mental world. I construct psychologically. And again, there's a long tradition, but yeah, Western world is psychological in the sense of our explanations. Constructionism, and I tend to be fairly radical in this way, I tend to not want to, I want to look at the mental as also construction. And so stay in the linguistic relational dimension. So I don't get into the question of minds inside bodies. But that we can come back to that if you want later. A lot hangs on that. Anyway, other reverberations, people who don't know much about constructionism at all, never heard the term or constructivism, it will come up in other ways, pluralism. Every time you hear that word, you got a friend. Because they're admitting, hey, look, there are a lot of ways to look at this thing. Different people, different groups can have any way. I mean, if you honor pluralism, you're really kind of hip pocket at doing construction. All those people are right on your side. Indigenous studies, indigenous psychology, indigenous medicine, and so on, as they come. It's the same thing. Well, maybe Western medicine or maybe Western ways of life are not everything. We better listen to some of the people who are indigenous or like been around a long time or have other traditions. It's kind of a pluralism. Hey, let's listen and honor other possibilities. And that's, you can find that in so many pockets. I mean, it's just there, seeping through Western culture. For me personally, and at least in psychology, this has also meant this move to qualitative methods of research. Now, There are a lot of things you can say about this, but the critique has been of quantitative research, the kind of controlled, variable, systematic, causal, experimental, hypothesis testing research. And there's a long history of why we need to pay attention to quality, which going back to at least the beginning of psychology in the 1800s. But more happened with that. There are other methods that got to be interesting and useful for different people, coming up in very small pockets. And what happened to qualitative, it got to be the umbrella term for a multiplicity. For example, you had discourse analysis. It wasn't exactly quantitative, it wasn't qualitative, it's a different kind of a thing. Action research. It's a kind of research, it's either quantitative or qualitative in the traditional sense. It's a different sort of phenomenon. Collaborative research practice, where you work with people to try to generate an understanding. I mean, these are coming from a variety of, and qualitative got to be the umbrella term for, you might say, pluralism. There are a lot of different ways to look at the world. And each method, you begin to recognize, carries with it its own language, its own values, its own constructions of the world in its terms. So within that group, you begin to realize, hey, look, there are a lot of different voices here with different things, different ways of looking at things, all possibly useful. Why not accept each other? And the result of that has been this kind of general loosening of what counts as a method, and even whether it's a method. If you go and look at what's happened in qualitative research, and I'm talking about across the social sciences, you take Tenzin Lincoln's book on qualitative research practices or inquiry. That book went through, I think, 4 editions in 10 years, because the whole qualitative movement just, it spawns creative ideas. Well, if there's no restrictions, if I'm not studying things for how they really are, and I've got to make sure I count it, and we're not representing the world, and there are no foundations, I can make up my own stuff to do what I want to do. Nobody heard of autoethnography 10 years ago. Now it's everywhere. There's been a whole sort of breakdown, the distinction between science and art. So arts-based research, and that's very difficult to know exactly what we're talking about here, because it's a lot of things, a lot of voices. We're using poetry, painting, drama, music, and so on, as part of, is it a method? Is it a form of representation? It's all in flux. And all that now becomes part of a huge dialogue going on across the social sciences. And it's like an invitation to this creative process. It's just mind-boggling when you get started into it. So this general loosening of the whole strictures, which is kind of, it's not constructionism per se, it is like, it speaks of the same process as questioning of the traditions in a way that opens up new possibilities. The advent of Buddhist practices in the therapy. Now, therapeutic practices in the modernist period were truth-seeking. There was going to be a form of therapy, going back to psychoanalysis, which was going to be the true and lodged in reason and lodged in evidence. And multiple forms of therapy each grew up with their own school, making claims for basic truth and keeping their people in line with those ideas. And you don't find that so much anymore. You know, I talked to a group of therapists last year, and I said, well, how many of you use Buddhist practices in your therapy? None of them are Buddhist, and about 80%. They just add it on. Because there isn't any kind of form of therapy you must do. I mean, even cognitive behavioral therapy, even though it's dominant, terms of requirements in the United States and much of Europe. Once you get into it, once you pass the test, it's an open game. It's like people do pretty much whatever they want to. I have a friend in Germany, a cognitive behavioral therapist, you go by his office, and all you hear is laughter. What's that guy doing in there? But it works for him. But it just laid with a different label. Anyway, it's just kind of loosening. It's ground and roots loosening. Okay. Now let me go back to constructionism, and what I see is the seeds of the alternative to mechanistic metaphor. All right, when I did this third edition of Invitation, I had to ask myself, well, what's new? I want to get the things that have happened since the last edition in here. Very little in terms of, you might say, some of the theoretical background. There are not a lot of new ideas in the history of science, sociology of knowledge. It's kind of variations on things that are 30 years old. I mean, it's not an explosion. Not much new in terms of narrative theory, literary theory, deconstruction theory. It's pretty much variations on things, and so on. Critical theory still lives, but it's again, variations on ideas that have already existed. So it's not like that's not a whole brand new landscape. What is new? Practices. What those ideas have helped to support or invite our practices. So in that first book, there was one chapter devoted to practice. In this book, there are 3 chapters devoted to practice, because that's where everything's happening. People developing, again, research practices, practices in organization. I mean, all I had almost in the first edition was AI. Now it's like collaborative practices all over the place. Interesting, fascinating things going on. Practices in therapy, mushrooming early on of all the sort of constructionist-based therapies into collaborative therapies now, which are not so school-bound. It's more greater concern with what are the practices, how does it work, how does it go? Now, let me go to the next slide, because this is, you can also begin to see what this is going to do for modernism. Okay, so, yeah, if you look at those practices, there are 2 things about them which are really important. One is, these are the practices that have grown out of constructionism, of which most of you are part. You quickly realize there are no fundamental units. Everything can be reconstructed. And secondly, that reconstruction is an us. It requires a collaboration of some kind. It's not my reconstruction, it's us. We do it together. So in some sense, units cease to be so interesting as the process by which we make it happen. Subtle shift now, away from getting the world right, getting it orderly, into, hey, we can make it what we want through collaboration, and stability, that is getting it fixed, so we know how it all works. Much more interested in that process of negotiation, dialogue, what happens next as we move through this, what are the phases, what are the sequences, what happens next in the conversation. Very little of let's fix it, test it. Much more, how do we do the talk, how do we do the relationships. Causality, you hardly hear that among, I would say, among much of what you do. You may get into it a little bit with consequences. That is, how could we measure it? I mean, AI is deeply into that. Show me the evidence that AI works. And there's a lot of resistance among AI community to having to test it. Because you realize, if you're in the constructionist stuff, that the test too is a construction of some sort, and that may not be the way to proceed. But causality, just as a concept, which, look, when I grew up was essential, I had to understand the world as causal, just isn't there. Structural explanation, how many of you rely on, I'm not saying none, on psychology to explain what happens in the dialogue, or what happens in the negotiation, what happens in the mediation, what happens in the collaborative research, what happens in the action research? It just becomes muted. Where is the talk of sociology? Where is the talk of social structure? I'm not saying it's dead, but it's just muted. Because there's a much more emphasis on how it is that here and now, in this space, we're going to make something happen. And knowledge as a map ceases to be interesting as we're testing hypotheses so we can get better and better and better, because we know that any practice that we develop, it's going to have a restricted lifespan. That AI works only because of a cultural condition. Narrative therapy works only because of a cultural condition. Anytime you try to make one of these practices into a system, in the old sense, let's make it a method, it'll die pretty rapidly. As soon as people know they're being put into a method, well, whose method is that? What's it doing to me? I mean, we're already critically alert to this. So it's like you almost have to keep these practices alive by continuous reworking them in some way, or new audiences of a new way of doing it. Keep that whole knowledge-making production in continuous motion. Now, get the themes that I'm generating here. Collaboration, negotiation, no causality, no particular interest in, you're interested in making the future, not predicting it, form on action, all that stuff that's built in, first of all, the constructionist ideas about knowledge, gets into inform or underlie, in some sense, the way in which we understand our practices, now moves out into the culture, academic culture, practical culture. Academic culture. Whole movement, and I should say it's not just from units. If you keep pressing that outward, you're going to rapidly get to relational, something relational. It's not the units that count, it's the relationship. First of all, the collaboration among us, but then beginning to understand that the world is all made up of that way. And in that collaboration, you can't easily separate out what's me from you. Because that collaboration is a conversation, and I can't do it alone. We can only do that together in some way. So I am not the unit, you're not the unit. The unit's got to be somehow, if we're going to talk about units at all, in the process of our being together. So what we need is, why units as individual isolated things? Why not a relational way of looking at the world? Now, there are a lot of constructionists, particularly theorists, who pick this up, and now there's a whole sort of group who call themselves relational constructionists, because that's what they want to do. They want to construct the world in terms of, understand it in terms of relationship. That's a huge and important project, because if you can do that, you basically change the whole worldview from Aristotle into the 21st century. There aren't any units anymore. There's only relationship. we don't know how to talk about it. We don't have the language for it. A language fights us, and we in constructionism are not the only people who do this. If you look at the term relational, if you look at the term, I can't remember, is it the Google counting facility, where you can look at the frequency, word frequency. In the last 30 years, relational goes boom. It's just not us who are talking about that. It's everywhere. I just found last week 3 books of relational sociology. 2 years ago, the whole psychoanalytic movement on relational. Let's move away from individual minds to relational process. Look at all that's going on in environmentalism and ecology. It's all relational. You can't understand any plant species or any individual activity of anything outside of the ecology in which it exists. All of Darwinianism is being rewritten as we sit here, not in terms of survival of any species, but in terms of interrelated species, how they support each other, how no species can survive without the others, and how our whole existence is based on microbiotic, cells inside, other life that we depend on. So we're made up of all these living creatures. I mean, that whole mindset, we can't see it anymore in terms of individual, isolated, alienated, bounded units. Now, you move on from stability then, as long as you've got relational, it's hard now to have stability. Because as I said before, once you've got a unit that you can describe, to be a unit, it's got to have some stability. If you have a relational, it's not clear what kind of stability you ever have. Because as you rapidly realize, there's no end to how you can expand that relational process. That is, you can take the dialogue we're having as a relational process, but yet you realize rapidly that that's based on a whole set of other dialogues. It's based on the air we breathe, the food we eat. It's based on the larger ecology, and you can expand and expand, so that this dialogue is part of a vast, vast sum of whatever's going on, so that anything can impact anything else. So you just are not fascinated by stabilities anymore, but by process. And this also gets picked up now. You've got a whole movement in the organizational field of process theory. Big meeting every year in Greece. Process thinkers, actors, researchers, and so on. Process men, process theology. All this is going on now outside of constructionism in particular, but these are all movements that are in like synchrony with things that we do. So in that sense, you can begin to see whatever we're doing as part of a much larger movement. Now, let me just locally get back to a little bit of something. Always a question about associates, whether this person is part of, sort of in line with the kind of thinking we do. And as one school says, well, constructionism has these kind of suppositions, and we should only have people who really have all those suppositions in line. Now, I have not liked that view very much at all. I don't want to draw a line around what constructionism is and say these are the necessary principles, and anybody you're either in or out. But if the practices are synchronous, if they make sense within that whole sort of underlying perspective, hey, let's talk. Because we may have some words to add to what you're doing, but your practices will add to what we're doing. So many of you here may not know very much about constructionism. It's possible. But what you're doing is very much part of the dialogues. and the kinds of things that we're attempting to do. What's behind things. And I don't see this everywhere, but let me give you one good example. It's a big movement in organizational theory. Organization is practice. Leadership is practice. Group functioning is practice. Now, what that generally is all about is taking away anything behind that's pushing, like Marxist materialism or psychoanalytic repression, and saying, let's focus on what makes up the here and now of what we're doing that brings it about. It's a whole way of thinking that's going on here, to have this conversation, how is it working in terms of what I do, what you do, and how these things are related, how we bring the chairs into it, how we bring the floor, the lighting, because all this is going to be interconnected. And if you want a good discussion group, if you want a good leadership, it's those interlocking practices that you have to pay attention to. How do they function together? Without trying to go back to explain it by something else. It just sort of drops away. It becomes a much more pragmatic. How can we do it? And what elements do we need? Because this is all going to be related. So this focus on the here and now that creates whatever is to come. Creates whatever is to come. Doesn't predict it. It creates it, which brings me to predictability. Again, you move from predictability as being the end to get it all straight and make it all work. So the notion that there's a continuous kind of emergent quality, that what we make will lead to something which will lead to something else. You do AI, it's not a permanent fix, it's just a piece of conversation. You do therapy, it's not a permanent impression, it's part of the conversation. It may do something in the here and now that you don't know. It's like Frank Barrett and improvisation. Life is more of an improvisation. You have to pick up what's happening and do something with it. It's going to lead somewhere else, and the consequences you don't know. And all vary. We don't know. All we can do is act to hope together that something will happen from that. Complexity theory gets into it a little bit, where you realize that the system's always in change, and they're going to be emergent properties. So things are going to emerge out that were not part of the past, and the system is going to be altered as a result of it. Now let me have the last slide. What I'd like to suggest and propose is that you can see implicit in all this movement a kind of an alternative to the mechanistic metaphor. I want to call it protean, which is problematic in some ways, but I'm trying to get a way of understanding where there is continuous, unpredictable change, something that you can't hold on to. I can't even say it, and that's part of the point. I don't want to be able to say it. I don't want to have it to be a thing, like a machine, but more of a sense of our life is about continuous movement and change. And we're in it. We're locked in it together in our world, so that we move through to a relational thing. Yeah, we understand that it is relational. That has always got to be part of the premise of doing anything. Like the background of modernism is machine-like. That we're not interested in stabilizing and fixing it. it is inevitably in process. And by the way, this is to go back to Aristotle, with this emphasis on atomistic units. Now we've got this whole divide in Greek philosophy between Aristotle and Plato on the one hand, and Heraclitus and other philosophers who are all process philosophers. The metaphysics of the process philosophers from Heraclitus, everything is in flow. You never put your foot in the same river twice, nor is it the same foot. I mean, it's a whole way of understanding. Everything is in movement. Totally different perspective on how it is we're living our lives. It's not, it's like I mean, in terms of Western history, it would be a profound change in orientation. Relation, process, confluence. Now, that's my term, and there are a lot of other ways to look at this, but I'm trying to find a term that you understand things not in terms of causal units hitting each other, but the flowing together of flow is, you can't say the thing, but you might say the currents. But currents are never stable, so you look at whatever is now as a flowing together of relational process. So, to make this practical for a moment, again, the question would be, for the success of an organization or therapy or a life, it's not the well-being of the unit. And it's not only the well-being of a relationship. So for example, in therapy, it's not that person's mind that's important, it's a person's relationship, but that relationship within a larger process, right, which could include physical environment. So the flowing together at a particular time in history, because the flows will continue to change. And we understand things in terms of the confluence, and thus trying to work with the whole confluence as opposed to the individual. And again, going from structural explanations where we get very involved with the theory behind it into working with the thing, with the here and now, with the mediation process, with the community building process, with peace building and so on. How do we do it? What is it composed of? The knowledge then ceases to be a map of anything. Its knowledge is always in the making. What comes next? It becomes much more pragmatic. How does it function? What can we do with it? What happens next? And what are the values attached to that? Because this is all about values. What world do we want to see? What do we hope for? How can we communicate with each other about multiple views? Okay. That's a lot of words. What I'd like to do is, well, first of all, I want to get some of this discussed in groups, because I want to go back to what this would mean if we're moving towards a protean perspective. If we are, and that's up to question too. And even whether this is a good way to put it. But what would it mean? Before we do that, I just want to check out. Anybody want to have a question, add something, we'll just make for clarity here if I can. Yeah, and I can't hear anybody because I'm deaf.
Can you just start to touch on it, and I hope this is an okay question. You're just starting to touch on it, and I hope this is an okay question. It might be a whole other discussion. But can you clarify a little bit between process and pragmatism? Because I think a lot about, you start off by saying this is a Western story, and I was just thinking about, American pragmatism and our often strong influence to do and to change and to make. And I wanted to distinguish that between process a little bit more, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up in a way, and it's also going to be conflictual. I mean, a lot of people who move in these circles, Dewey comes back in a big way, like the Renaissance in Dewey. I'll give you many examples for it. A rediscovery of Dewey, who was trying to generate a pragmatic alternative to foundationalism, even though it was a much more individualist view that Dewey had. Now, I don't know whether the distinction is right between process and pragmatism, but there is a sense in which, yeah, the view here would be we're always in process, but whatever we're doing is going to affect what comes next. So if you're doing organizational work, the question is, well, what do we do now to make next viable? You begin to think pragmatically in terms of not the theory that I can apply, but in terms of the units or the confluence necessary to bring that about. Now the piece that kind of will be a little bothersome is a hint of modernism in all that. That all we're doing is getting outcomes. And the question is whether you can rework pragmatism so it isn't a matter of, well, I just do what I want to make an outcome. It's very interesting. Obama, for example, has been called a pragmatist. Now, what does that mean? Usually when it's applied politically, it means you're not setting your agenda so that you just want to make that agenda work. You work because there are a lot of different voices, and if you want some outcome which is somewhat better, you've got to listen and put that together in a way that will work for everybody. And it's a little bit that kind of thing that I'm after. I still have this residual that says, isn't there a space for not doing anything at all, or for going with the flow? But I can't quite solve that one.
The pragmatist approach within a more Confucian frame of mind is whether the knowledge is useful and what can I do with this knowledge? How is it practically available to me and applied? So from an Asian perspective, that comes in.
I'm glad you brought that up, because here is, there's a nice link into a lot of Asian philosophy and why Buddhism makes sense. In some ways, it's not a cure, it's learning how to do something. And Confucianism, you go back, there are hints of Confucianism in where we're going here. There, you can pick up Lao Tse philosophy, you can begin to find pieces of it here. Not identical, but they're just echoes of both Confucius and Lao Tse in this. You must understand things as movement, and you can't control it all. And it's got to have somehow taken into account more than the individual, and that you can't necessarily trust the words as being the real.
Thanks. As I'm trying to understand this, there feels a kind of politic, a progressive politic embedded in the vision. With that in mind, I have sort of a background question, which is, the mechanistic view is allegedly, but never apolitical, value neutral, but never. Causality, you're moving it towards confluence. Knowledge is mapped, knowledge is making. But these are makings that have a particular direction involved in what one seeks to study. What I'm wondering about is, within this, especially with the notion of causality, the parallel moves to replace causality as a subset of a broader concept of understanding. That's what I'm actually going to ask you about, was how you view the concept of understanding, and rule following, meaning things that are systematic, that have unless clauses. what would serve as a format for acknowledging something is understood?
So much there, and we could have a long discussion. Let me just pick up on the end part of it, or let me do two things. The politics of causality, for one. I mean, that's not a neutral concept. Once we start looking at ourselves as causally related, or government related to people as a causal relationship, it is an alienating relationship. I cause you. And everybody wants to be the cause, not the effect. Nobody wants to be the effect of anything. And government says we're going to cause this to happen, and they have a right to, because that's how change happens, is to make it happen. So it's politically loaded. Politically loaded both in politics per se, in terms of everyday life. So the confluence has its own politics, which you might say is much more supportive of a relational view, that whatever is going to work is going to require us collaboratively to bring it forward. So it's a much more politically sort of everyday, listen to each other, take it into account, work it out, because otherwise what we're going to have, that confluence is going to be mutually annihilated. And that's the state we're sort of reaching now in sort of world history, where we have the capacities for annihilation, depending on how that confluence manages. Now, let me say, the understanding bit. There are a lot to be said about what we mean by understanding, and I'm going to just pass up a lot of that and just talk about what it would mean in education. Because generally, we want to impart knowledge, the knowledge that we have, which will be propositions about the nature of the world, get it all right, get the chemical tables right, know what the planets are, distance to the moon, the number of continents, the number of races, blah, blah, blah. And maybe you do some experimentation to learn how people do that in science, and so on. What this would suggest is that that whole emphasis is kind of bankrupt. People don't take in the propositions, they're not contextualized, they just vanish after 2 years and less. Nobody remembers much of anything. And it moved much more toward education as embedded in, and here comes Dewey a little bit, embedded in the process of making, in the collaborative process of making. So understanding is not putting it into a rational system. Understanding is about knowing how to move with the process. It really changes the whole way of thinking about pedagogy. From a top-down pedagogy to a much more collaborative, communally based immersion in action.
I think maybe there are two kinds of Taoists in the world. I think there are two kinds of Taoists in the world. For example, the ones here that's the associates of Taoist institutes. But the other kind is about a kind of traditional Chinese Taoist. Yeah, they believe in Taoism. The Tao in Taoism, like the way of the universe. And if I understand appropriately, so the Chinese traditional Taoists holds a different kind of view. So for Taoists here, they hold a protein worldview, but for Chinese traditional Taoists, they may hold a kind of a balance between a kind of persistent nature and protein worldview. Something maybe in nature unchanged, but something maybe changes. It keeps a balance between the two. So What do you comment on this opinion?
It just, in some way, underscore what I was saying earlier. I think you find in this sort of movement a lot of echoes of Buddhism, of Confucianism, of the Tao. Not exact. You can't just, it's not the same, but it's pieces of it get picked up, which become useful. Become sort of, oh, well, that just opens up a whole other way of understanding here. Some words, some metaphors, might be able to use those. They will help us. Yeah.